And so I finally.
We're ready when you're ready.
In September, I finally got the picture. And so from now on,
I'm ready to go.
Yeah, we're good.
I'm not seeing anything coming up.
It should be live now. It says 15 seconds.
So that was, and so now I'm on massive.
All right.
Oh, there it is.
There we go.
Oh my God, this is weird. I see myself in your screen.
Yeah.
So
All right.
3 weeks in.
All right, hey folks, we're starting. Where's the? All right, hey folks, we're gonna get started now. So thanks everybody for coming. So hey Sergey, good to see you. It's been a while. So good to see a lot of faces here. Some familiar, some unfamiliar. I hope to get to know as many of you as possible tonight. I'm Eric Goldstein, principal engineer here at Babel. Very honored to have you all here. Obviously, very honored to have the SolidJS core team. Some of the core members here, Ryan, Dave, and Moshe. And I encourage you to, get out there and talk to them if you have an opportunity to. And we got some interesting presentations planned. And hope you guys find it as interesting as I do. And either way, again, glad to have you here. And I guess you didn't come here to listen to me talk, so let's get it started.
Awesome. Thank you. Hello. Thanks so much for coming out, everybody. Am I in the right spot?
Yeah, that's fine.
Hello.
Next, I should remove my name.
Can you turn the audio on? Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us. This was a bit to get set up. We decided to have the stream, so this is all being live streamed right now. We have 3 presentations tonight. I'm going to give a brief intro on Solid. I'll try to keep it a bit shorter because we have a lot more content planned than I expected. Ryan will then be going up and demoing some new material. I'm very excited to hear it. And then we have Moshe coming up and giving us a talk on some advanced topics. So that being said, as soon as Ryan says we're good to go.
I can't remove my name. Everyone's going to be Ryan Carniato tonight.
Oh, that's fine.
All right.
Don't worry about the marquee titles or anything like that.
All right. And we are good.
Cool. And I use this. How do I switch the slides? Okay, perfect. So, my name is David DiBiase. I'm a community leader and an ecosystem maintainer at Solid. Welcome to this evening's event. This talk is mostly to go over what is Solid. And so I guess I'll start with the first one. Good news, yet another JavaScript framework. Yay. We get this a lot in the community, and it's just packed with a lot of motion for us. Yes, there are a lot of JavaScript frameworks out there, but Solid is doing something unique. It's something different than everything else you've seen out there. It looks very similar to something like React, but under the hood it is something very magical, very, very different. Just some high-level details. Solid is actually a recipient of 2 awards this year. The first one was the OS Awards for Breakthrough of the Year. This is the same award won by, I think it was Svelte and Vue in the past few years. So we're in good company. We're off to a good start with this project. These are the other projects that we were up against. We also won the InfoWorld Bossy Award. They gave us a really fantastic review and talking about why Solid was up against some other great competitors. Astro, Quick, Svelte were in the same category as well. Well, Svelte actually won last year. So who's behind Solid? It's this guy right here. Ryan is a Marco.js core member, principal open source software engineer at Netlify. So we're in good company. This is a guy who knows what he's talking about. Solid has 6 core members and 8 major sponsors, so it is a well-supported project. It is not at the scale of something like React, which has a full corporate sponsor, but we get a lot of support from a lot of really well-recognized firms, such as Cloudflare, Netlify, Builder, Vercel, JetBrains. I think that's most of them. So Solid, a bit about it. Simple and performant reactivity for building user interfaces. We have this splattered on our website. It's basically, the skinny of it is the reactive nature of Solid is both simplicity and performance. It's not either or. You get the combination of both, and that is something special. Solid is 7 kilobyte minified gzipped. We have, actually, that's an incorrect stat. I think we're at 24,000, approaching 25,000 stars. It's 5 years in development, supports TypeScript, it's top rated in performance, and it has Astra and Beat support. This is our star history for the past little while. It has a comparison to other projects beside it. Obviously, we're not quite in the realm of React and Vue, but we're off to a good start. I guess the rest of the slides go into a bit more technical detail, but Ryan's here to explain it to you directly. So at this point, now that I've introed the basics of the project, I'm just going to hand it right off to him, and we'll take it from there.
All right. One thing that occurs to me is I do a lot of live coding, and there's no mic stand, is there? One-handed live coding. All right, let's see what we can do here. Okay, give me a second, because I've been working on a new presentation to see if I could get even more live coding into my demo. But yeah, let's see if I can get this going. One sec.
You could use that pencil holder over there if you want. The blue thing. That's a good point. Right there. You can stick it right in there.
See, the question is, will people still be able to hear me? Because at this distance, a dynamic microphone is not gonna.
I can turn the volume up and see what happens.
Yeah, we don't want to risk feedback either. It's okay. 2 seconds. Let me just adjust a couple things. All right. There we go. Kind of on the fly setup. All right. Well, I guess to start, actually, how many of you are familiar with SolidJS? Okay, yeah. I mean, this is something I probably should ask right off the beginning, just because I've been giving some talks recently about SolidJS, and a lot of you might have seen a lot of that content before, or it kind of trickles down. I was trying to change it up a little bit today, but depending on familiarity, kind of gauge where we are in this, because I still find the best way to introduce someone to SolidJS still is just seeing that transparency, seeing that ability for it to just, come up from just simple JavaScript. At this point, though, I feel like a lot of people have actually seen that demo. So that's why I was prepping something a little bit different today. I wanted to talk a bit about Solid and Solid Start, which is the idea here. So let's keep on going. Right, logo pending, but Solid Start is Solid's equivalent to like a SvelteKit or Remix or Next.js. It's a more opinionated framework to make it a little easier to do server-side rendering, basically. But it's done in a very, I don't know how to call it, like solid flavor is the best way I could put it, which allows us to take things in like a slightly different direction. You might be thinking that's a pretty bold statement, taking things further along that path. But if you understand a little bit about SolidJS itself, it's not that surprising. So let's talk about that for a minute. I'll try and go a little bit faster through this part if you're a bit familiar. But I started working on Solid back in 2016. For context, it's about the same year Svelte was created. I actually have a private repo where the first commit was, I think, August 2016. But my goal was to bring back fine-grained reactivity. I'm a big fan of Knockout.js. Been using function components, building UIs, composing these things for quite some time, and I really like those patterns. And React came along and said, "Hey, let's use classes." And I was like, "No, that's what I did in .NET. I did not want to go back there." It's funny how these things like go in cycles, but it was actually like I had this very knee-jerk reaction to when I first saw React. I actually like React a lot more today than I did back in those early days. But yeah, so I was kind of like on a mission to kind of prove things out, perhaps, so to kind of show that maybe things could be a little bit different than we thought they could be. I kept on hearing things like, "Oh, the virtual DOM is really fast," or something, and I was like, I don't know about that. Like I want to see what's actually going on. So yeah, I did that a bunch. Came to this conclusion. For all the good that we have in our component architecture, and I mean it's like everywhere. We kind of conflated code organization with execution life cycles, and in pretty much every framework, components have this like runtime consideration, and they're basically our primary state management. They're our renderer. They're really our everything. And this is not just like limited to the VDOM. This is true of like, I don't know, compiled solutions, non-compiled, template literals, stuff, web components you find, single file components to, the latest DSLs. Everything has this kind of like top-down structure where everything is done at this component granularity. So I get a bit of it like, who cares, but the problem is it's not just like a performance thing that's like, it hits you. It's kind of like, it informs every subsequent question. It's like, when do I memoize? What do I use for global state? How do I share reactivity between files? When to use effect? What's the difference between Redux and context? And, why does this log twice or re-render? Like, it basically affects everything that happens downstream of that decision. And the thing is, these topics have been dominating conversations for quite some time now. And I'd rather talk about pretty much anything else. Wait, how did this slide get in here? No, in all seriousness, these two examples are more similar than most people realize. They've already painted a box around what a component is. It basically, when you update its local state, it triggers component re-renders. And it doesn't really matter like the syntax, or whether the whole file is a component. It has this kind of thing in common. And so but whether it's a bunch of hooks to tell us what to memoize, like use callback, use memo, use ref, React memo, all our dependency array fun, or a compiler to generate code. That didn't come out. Is it just still loading? Yeah, there we go. Weird. Compiler to generate code like this. This is actually from the React pseudo code from the React compiler they're working on, but it isn't really unlike Svelte, to be fair. You could like write let to-dos and you end up with something like this. In either case, the user or the event updates the state, we mark the component as dirty, and then we rerun it. We check against memoized values to reduce work. It doesn't really matter, as I said, if it's a set state or an assignment. It's all really the same thing. And this is where I drop reactivity in. For anyone who's not familiar, just say like, there is another option perhaps. I talk mostly about something called fine-grained reactivity, and I could go on and on about like how it's declarative and composable, or helps produce well-structured code that's reusable and independent of the component system. Even how like with a few basic primitives, you can do everything you ever wanted to, including rendering. And with performance, that is quite impressive. But it's generally easier to show this. So, you might have seen this example by now, but essentially I'm going to go back to kind of the beginning here where we kind of got like a hello world type app, but this time there's a little special flavor in here with signals, essentially. So what I've got here is something called create signal, friend, set friend. It's a tuple. They're both functions. And the idea here is we could just read from a value to write it, or update it using our set friend function and read it again. But the reason we care about reactivity is because we have this concept of effects, basically, which are like the other half of the story. And this way we can compress the code a bit, because now our effect reruns whenever the signal changes. essentially we can start with a name like John, set to Mary, and then it logs immediately without us having to worry about it. This is why we care about reactivity. And even more so the fact that the reactivity is transitive. By that I mean, we have this ability to transform it just using functions and still be able to benefit it in the same kind of system. This is not a compiler doing it, it's runtime. And people probably may have seen this before, but I still love this thing. I looked at this straight off Dan Jutan's talk from Belgium. He's kind of mastered how to explain reactivity, and I love it because it really can be done in only a few lines of code. I think I usually say 50, but I think this example, which is kind of pseudocode, is about 30 lines of code. So just gonna talk through it for a second, but essentially a signal is a read-write tuple, right, where we read from a value that we get passed in and we write to it. But we need to have subscribers, essentially, if we wanted to update when our effects run. So from here, we add our subscribers, and we also add this idea of a global context. This global context is a stack. We can ask what's on top of the stack whenever we want, and that's basically the key to this mechanism, because as long as we have the stack, we can create our effect. And this will do is the end user provides an end user function, like my silly console log there, and every time we run it, we basically, and this is including the first time we run it, we call that execute. What it does is it pushes itself onto the stack, runs the user provided function, and then pops itself off the stack. And this is important because any signal that is read under that context while it's pushed onto the stack can see it and add it to its list of subscribers before returning the value. And then, sometime later, like we set the name to Mary, like in that example, it set the new value, go through the subscribers, call their execute function again, and that just restarts the whole cycle again, tracking, pushing itself on the stack, executing the function, adding it to the subscribers, and so on. So no compiler magic. This is purely runtime. And what's funny about it is you can start with this and essentially build a whole army of primitives on top of it. In SolidJS, we have something called solid primitives, but we also ship a few with the core library. Things like create memo, which are expensive stuff, stores, which are for nested proxies, and then resources, which are for async. They basically turns promises into signals. And yeah, I'm just thinking of time here. I got to ask you guys, how many of you have seen me turn vanilla JS to JSX at this point? Just out of curiosity. Just so if it's only half, I'm going to do it one more time because I never get tired of doing this demo. But okay, let's do it. Give me a sec. Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry, I'm gonna pull that out of that. Bang. Okay. This is what happens when you do it last minute.
Why don't you sit down?
And one more, two more. And this one. All right. One of them I opened twice. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see this. All right. Yeah, why don't I just sit down? That'd make my life easier, wouldn't it? But yeah, the basic examples, people seen reactivity before if they've used Vue. Sure. Screw it. I'll sit down. People have seen reactivity before if they've used Vue or MobX or something. And it's every time we teach reactivity, we show this kind of thing where we're like, oh, let's console log something. And if you can see down here, there's a count of 0, the count is 1. We're console logging. And I don't want to full screen, but I do a little better there. But we probably want to do something. I want to show something a little bit more substantial because you can do more with effects than just console log. So just gonna make an H1 here because there's really nothing that stops us, and this is just vanilla DOM API that of setting this text content of this H1, and then document body. Let's append this to the DOM. Count as 1. So this we started at 0, but because this ran right away, like if I comment this out, we might end up at 2. Yeah, this is why I do this. Hot reloading with a framework doesn't always work perfectly. Oh, right. This version of the playground. Oh, right. It's all good. So if we have one, it happens right away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a button, and I've done this demo before, so the button's already here. Makes life a little bit easier. So essentially, what I've done is taken our example with our H1 and now added a button, creating the button, set some text content for the button, and then added a click handler that says that, hey, make the count +1 whenever you click the button. And this is just vanilla JS, essentially just updating a signal, and then this one effect updating this, bit of text here on the screen. And as you can see, we have a working counter here. So this is just our effect updating some text now instead of console logging. And we just connected to vanilla. But the thing that I want to show here is that no one really writes code like this. I mean, it'd be great. Like, this could be optimized. You could write like the most perfect vanilla code if you did this. But it'd be convenient if instead we could just, maybe write JSX and have it compile into basically the same thing, right? Just some vanilla JavaScript. So if I take this, put this on here, and go on click, bang, get rid of this now. Tell TypeScript to stop complaining at me. You can see our counter still works because all this is still just a DOM element, this button here, that we're appending to the DOM using vanilla APIs. We just happened to compile it to creating an element and adding a click handler to it. And we can do the same trick with this H1 as well, because what we can do is we can just use JSX. And there's one little difference here. Solid's compiler knows to look for function calls, for signal calls, essentially, and knows, hey, that could be reactive, and knows to wrap that in an effect automatically. So what we can do is do this, get rid of the $sign, and with that, we can get rid of this too. And it still works because, again, we're just creating an H1 with an effect that just updates that one bit of text here, this one text node here, and that's it. But I mean, truthfully, we still don't even really author like this. I mean, usually we want to kind of package up our stuff so we can reuse it. So I'm just going to grab all this and stick it in here. And now the function, so we need to return maybe an array with our H1 and our button. And I'm just going to call our function, because it's just a function, call it once, and then see a bunch of stuff. So you gotta spread it in and maybe format it a little bit nicer. Okay. And okay, it's still working because, again, we just called a function that created some DOM elements and are appending them to the DOM. And if I do a little bit more formatting, we could probably make our lives a little bit nicer. Like, no one really does that. They kind of inline these, and instead of using arrays, maybe we can use like a JSX fragment, kind of make it look more like a template. And if I format this all right, and actually this is kind of a mess too. Why not just import render from SolidJS Web, which is very similar if you use React to React DOM. It basically, we only export all the web related stuff here. The core library Solid is actually agnostic. It doesn't need to run with a DOM or the web. It's basically it could run native or with WebGL. We can kind of clean up this a little bit too and make it render our counter into, looks like there's an app in here in this version of the playground. So we can go like that. And this little thing, it's refreshing to be sure, our counter still works. And it kind of looks like something some people may have seen before in other frameworks. Although there is that huge difference, is that we're only calling this counter function once still. So if you see it's logging counter here, when I click this, it's never going to log the counter again. Because why should it? Because all we're doing is wrapping an effect around this one thing. So you update the state, the things that change update, just this one text node essentially. This seems like a cool trick. I've actually seen some other frameworks do this trick as well, even with a virtual DOM. But like this is all Solid. There's no virtual DOM. You just saw what we built without it. And we can take this a little bit further because we can always add 2 counters to the page, right? And as you can see now, it logs twice. That's what that 2 is. It's just telling you it repeated because now there are 2 counters. So now it logged twice. But each one has its own signal and its own state. And when we click on it, they independently update. And again, we have used closures essentially to contain our state. So we do get actual, I don't want to call it like components in a classic sense, but we still get to basically encapsulate our code and make it modular. What's always interesting for this is if you've been following along, it should be fairly obvious to know what will happen here, but it sometimes surprises people that if we pull the signal out, again, this counter is just a function that runs once. There's no lifecycle connection to it. That now both instances just refer to the same signal. So we've effectively created global state just purely by where the signal is created, right? This is just using basically the rules of JavaScript, right? If it's inside the function, then it gets enclosed with the function. If you pull it out and it's referencing the same variable, it lives in that scope. And honestly, I could probably take this even further and show that like we could actually put that state maybe in a parent component and pass it down through props. See, this one's passing down it as props children. So that's what this is. And then we're passing down the click handler. And what I've done here intentionally is made each props children do something a little different. One's the value of count and one's count times 2. And the other one increments 1 and one increments 2. Just kind of show how we can kind of mess with that. And then we still have a counter console log and we still have our app. As you can see, it logs app and then counter. And as we update, we're not logging anything because this mechanism of passing the reactivity through means that none of these components need to rerun for this. It's still just updating that one effect that updates these text nodes. In this case, there's 2 now, one for each one. This one goes up by 2. This one goes up by 1. But it never needs to rerun in the components. It doesn't matter how many components you add. You can add 10 layers of components with prop drilling. You can add context. None of that has any bearing on how this updates. And it's important to see too, because we actually pass things down by value. Like this count times 2, you might be thinking, well, you didn't pass the signal down. How is it still doing this? And there's a little trick to that. And it's very similar to what we did with create effect. When we see the function call in the JSX, we wrap it in a getter, which means that accessing it like props.name, that's the point at which it calls the function. Which is really handy because if this means that the consumer doesn't need to worry about it. Consumer can pass a string, they can use a signal, they can use store, they can use whatever they want. You author your component to how you want the reactivity to work, and then the consumer, like you don't have to write is signal a bunch of places. Like the consumer can just use it without having to worry about like these kind of, split APIs. It's a single API that just works optimally, as long as you don't destructure. but yeah, I mean, I talk about this a lot. I call this the reactive advantage. And that's that components run once. There's no hook rules or stale closures. Templates compile to real DOM nodes, and it's a it's a really super low abstraction over the DOM, right? Like state independent of components, and you get to basically organize the code the way you want to, rather than to try and like jimmy the framework into doing what you want. Funny enough, though, I don't know how we are on time, but I'm actually not here to talk about these primitives. I'm actually here to talk about. I want to talk about some other primitives as well. And this has to do with the power of actually Vite. I'm going to just wax poetic about Vite next, because I think Vite is really quite cool, and their plugin system, which is actually inspired, I believe, by Jason Miller's work on HMR, it's game changing, because it really it basically. I didn't want to make a meta framework like Solid Start, like a Next.js or Stalkit. I had no interest in it. I pushed back for like years. I was like, yes, someone in the community will make it. I don't want to make it. But about 2 years ago, I was like, okay, fine. Well, maybe there's something here. And the reason for that was largely because of Vite. And it starts kind of understanding what I wanted in terms of desired outcomes. I knew that SSR is where everything was heading. That was the thing. Like, I created Solid not thinking about SSR, and then it was very obvious even a couple of years ago that like SSR was going to be the thing. Like Next.js had already been taking off. At this point, people are like, don't even look at your framework if it doesn't have like a meta framework. It's like expected. And a lot of the innovation in the space is finding how to better leverage the server-client divide. So you really needed SSR to be part of the package. At the same time, I didn't really want to throw single-page apps under a bus, so to speak. I'm trying to think of how to put this right, but like moving between a client app and a server app doesn't mean you should like just make all new libraries, right? And I didn't want it to feel like a chore. It's good to have niceties like file system routing and all that stuff, but there's a lot more consideration when you get into SSR, and I knew that I wanted to make sure that we could actually make that kind of seamless. And of course, this is the trickiest one. As you saw, Solid renders kind of like really different than pretty much everything else. So it needed to actually work with that in a way that was optimal. I wasn't willing to just like be like, oh yeah, let's just re-render our routes when data changes. Like, that would not work very well for us. So, there's some challenges, and this is why I avoided it, because like to be at this, on the other hand, I'm just like, oh man, I didn't want to deal with this. Like who wants to deal with that configuration stuff? Like that's basically what you spend most of your time with. Like, when you're building this stuff, you're like, oh, I got to do like the Webpack config classically. And also, hard not to be opinionated when you start like pulling all the tools together. And while opinions can be good, I really wanted to try and make this project have wider use, right? Because you want people to be able to adopt and use the framework. I wasn't just going to like be like, no, this is the one way. Like, it's a different place when you have like 6 competing meta frameworks on the same framework. You can be like, we're doing it the remix way. But for us, we couldn't have that, like we needed a meta framework that people could use. And I'm not gonna lie, I never bothered with this stuff myself. Like create React app or Next or whatever. I like never touched that stuff before, like a year or so before. I just had no use for it. When we built stuff, we built our own configs. We did all that. So like it was like really strong arming me to actually go into the space, because I was just like, I don't know if I'd use it myself. Like there's a lot of considerations in this kind of zone, and like another one, I didn't want to be exclusive. I didn't want to be like, these are Solid Start only features. I didn't want people to feel like they're missing out. And this is about APIs and libraries. Ideally, you just use everything that already existed and you'd be happy. I didn't want to make a new router. I didn't want to make a new, like there's just so many considerations that suddenly, it's funny, the core library seems like something really small by comparison, like to actually maintain. Now you're suddenly maintaining this huge thing. So yeah, I'm giving a ton of reasons right now why I didn't want to do this. You can kind of see why I wasn't too interested. But like I did find a way to get the upsides and combat the downsides. And as I mentioned before, this is largely thanks to Veed. It's kind of based roughly on the rollup plugin system, but the devil's really in the details here. A lot of nuance. The key thing is that they did is that a single configuration for client and server allows you to build vertical plugins rather than like whatever that mess was we were doing before with like 5 different Webpack configs or whatever. Like you have SSR, you have dev, you have client build. These are like all with their own kind of configuration. And when you have to like build each configuration for that special case, it becomes kind of tricky. Whereas what Veed allowed us to do was just go like slice it the other way, where the same plugin could handle dev, SSR, and client all at the same time. And for that reason, you start slicing stuff differently. You start like slicing stuff by concern. You can be like, okay, file system routing is a concern. You start slicing it that way, and that opens things wide up. Because now we have these building blocks, you know, makes things kind of more effortless. And also, we just came with a bunch of really other cool stuff like virtual files and built-in glob imports. They made stuff really easy. And this is really important to me because, like, you know, if we could just point people to one direct place, we didn't have to like do much work. It basically leveraged the whole existing ecosystem. You know, things like CSS, you know, built into bundler. Things, you know, like we still have solid specific features, but anything we built for Solid Start would work with any solid project, solid B project, I guess at least. And more so, this could allow us to use Solid Start for any solid project. Right today we have the dgit templates, but this could replace that. You know, right now it's in beta, so I still recommend doing that for client-side stuff. But this had the ability to scale up and down. And it basically addressed like half the things on my list, you know, without having to worry about it. You know, stuff like file system routing. You know, there's no point making a solid start router for this. You know, it's just a Veed plugin. And honestly, we found since that, it's even better than that. With such a modular approach, we've been able to test ideas really rapidly. It's just a matter of writing another Veed plugin. This sort of experimentation is really important to us. And I'm going to give you an example. And this is was part of the Solid Start release announcement. But essentially, in Solid Rudder, we've had for the last couple of years this idea of a route data function. Essentially, you could define for a route, it essentially run this function when you navigate to it. And this works with nested routing as well. So it'd work on the client, and it would parallelize the fetching, and it'd work on client or server. We kind of built this in. But one thing we found when we went to a meta framework was people were like, where's get server-side props? Where's that, like, I always want to run on the server patterns, loaders, all that kind of stuff. So it became an interesting problem because you're like, you don't want to like alienate the existing client-side patterns. You want to kind of keep the flexibility there to kind of go between. And that's what led us to like one of these kind of experiments, because we're like, well, what if, you know, we could actually just introduce a primitive to do this? Did I go too far? Yeah, server functions. And this is an idea that we could write any server, any function that we could run on the server. This isn't a new idea. We've seen stuff like this using proxies, kind of like with Blitz. But the idea is we could just write a plugin for that, a very specific plugin that would work through dev, work through SSR, work through the client, and just package it up as a single thing and just try the idea out. And as it turned out, we kind of really liked it because it was quite powerful. The first obvious thing was when you have the same function in your code, well, you could, you know, call something silly here like hello world, and if you didn't give it the right arguments, well, TypeScript will complain at you, right? Because it's just defined in the same file. So, you know, we could basically type check. It's not, it's over the network boundaries, so there's like, you know, considerations there, but you could kind of develop with a little bit more confidence that these server functions could work with your TypeScript on both sides. And, you know, nothing stops people from using it, you know, in a normal kind of setting, because they did expose a URL. What was really cool here is that it kind of encapsulated the whole API process. I was really big on this because I wanted to see if we could do stuff with our RPCs instead of like API routes. Because like if you control both sides, you can optimize for that case more. And as I said, this started a simple experiment because really what we wanted to do was take this example of our route data and then be like, oh, what if when we fetch the story, we just servered it, right? Now, we could use reactivity to refetch it, get all the benefits of the fine-grained updates. This is a great resource, but it could be like solid query or whatever, like TanStack. It doesn't matter what it is. We could just use the same primitives in our ecosystem and upgrade them to basically be like get server-side props. And that was really cool. But you know, you see that from these building blocks, you start going, well, actually, I want more patterns. Maybe I want to do stuff like Remix or something. So we actually ended up kind of building in a primitive ourselves using server primitives just to kind of streamline people who wanted like this is their base case scenario. Again, the primitives exist so that we can build upon them. And this is part of that kind of experimentation. But with something like get server data, we could still keep things like you know, having update keys and essentially still be able to fetch always on the server. But as I mentioned a moment ago, this is so that we can power the converse side, which is create server actions. And this is a way that we were like, again, thinking very RPC instead of like a API route. So we're like, we can put as many server functions we want in a single file. We can spread it out. We don't have to be limited to the file system routing to do this. You can kind of arrange the routes the way you want, and then you can just arrange the data the way you want, because this is just a way of designing your components. So we're like, what if you could make as many actions as you want? And what are actions? Well, it's important. They tie into, this is a mechanism for mutation that's a bit opinionated, which allows us to kind of do optimistic updates. So like in this simple example, we're just toggling a to-do. You can picture a to-do example, you're just checking a box and switching it. What if we could, know if it's pending and show the optimistic UI along with it? And, even furthermore, what if we could still invalidate it the way that, this is a very similar pattern to like TanStack query or whatnot, but use the same kind of tools again. Again, you could just not use the system at all and use something TanStack query. But the point was we needed to ship with something that made this really straightforward for people to kind of like have the full solution. And while we're at it, I mean, why not have it work with forms and form data and have progressively enhanced forms, right? So you can see how these things all layer on top of each other. This is obviously more technical, but it reflects our design philosophy here, because it's about being able to find the right pieces to kind of both empower the ecosystem and also power experimentation. Because you can see from a straight path, we can basically, as long as we have the right primitives, we can accomplish very powerful things. Right. My favorite part of the story is that it started from an experiment with that one primitive, and that's basically how we develop in Solid. We create a primitive and try and see how to use it to determine its place in the world. I mentioned Solid primitives before. This is a great place. It's kind of like React used or Vue used. Sometimes there is an obvious need that can only be handled by core and it ends up in the core, but other times we test ideas for months, maybe even years, in our Solid primitive repo, to kind of get an idea of how useful this could be for people. And I just like it because this encourages community adoption and like being part of the conversations, RFCs, things like that, kind of help decide where the future of Solid goes. And the other cool thing about building with primitives is a lot of the work we've been seeing with compilers, things like people building stuff on top of Solid with Babel. I've seen felt like compilations because of how easy it is to build on top of it. And really, the second I saw Vite, for example, I knew we're kind of more of the same, right? That's kind of where the thinking is. Now, I got one more kind of set of demos to do. How are we doing on time, David? I'm looking at my clock and it's still California here.
I'd say, can you do it in 15 minutes?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because I tend to like Hacker News demos. I don't know if people have seen Hacker News demos, but I mean, this demo kind of lives up to what I was talking about here. I didn't actually put this together. Nikhil did, and the truth of the matter is, SolidStart is so volatile. I do not even know at this moment, and I don't mean volatile in APIs side. I know you're like, why is he telling me that SolidStart is volatile? This is an experimental feature, so we've been moving faster on it than on the core branch. So we're going to see what the state of it is right now. But essentially, I just wanted to kind of show that philosophy in practice in 2 secs. So I'm putting my mic down. Sorry. All right. Get off that screen. No. All right. All right. So I'm kind of already ahead of myself. That's what happens when you don't have time to undo your demo. All right. It's all good. What I want to show here is that with SolidStart, I've got this Hacker News demo that I've kind of showed off before, and I'm gonna make sure the vconfig is in reset. What's cool about SolidStart is we can do something. We can start a SolidStart project and say SSR false, and essentially, if I pm I'm never. All right, sorry. I'm going to use builds and instead of dev mode because that's the only way I can actually show the actual JavaScript. In dev mode, we kind of pull everything in. So excuse time here, but I'm going to do build. And then I'm going to do start. Show off what I'm showing off here. Okay, port 3000. Luckily, nothing else is on here. Localhost port 3000. All goes well. We'll have a client rendered Hacker News demo. And by client rendered, I mean that when we look at the network tab and we look at the document that we fetched when I refresh this page, what we're going to see is that this document, of course, yeah, SSR false is working wonderfully. Okay. This is exactly what I was talking about. Oh, did I not? Okay, let's make sure I saved everything. Okay. Oh, and let's make sure we're in the right beat config. That'll help. Sorry. Probably demoing the to-do MVCs just the other day. All right. Cool. Proxying to. Oh, you can really feel it. Proxying through my phone. Oh, it's because I'm in slow 3G. What you just saw there was streaming working. It looks like. But essentially, that's why there's actually, in this case, it wasn't even streaming. It's actually what you're seeing is client-side rendering. Sorry, my bad. Yeah. So what I wanted to show here was that you can actually see the loading because we don't, in a client-side rendered app, you don't fetch the data until you render the HTML. So you send the HTML, load the JavaScript, then run the JavaScript, fetch the data, and do it. And you're seeing suspense kick in there. So just to show what I was talking about, you can see here that the body is empty, and then essentially what we're going to see over the network is we're literally fetching to stories and grabbing the stories from this API endpoint for the client. As we navigate around, it kind of upgrades up. So this is basically your Create React app of the world, your standard solid dget template version of it. But what's cool is you can build this with solid start and get to leverage stuff like file system routing and our actions and forms and all the cool features that I was just talking about, except server, because server doesn't make any sense because it's client only here. But you can kind of get started and use our nested routing and all that kind of stuff. But the difference between that code base, because just to kind of show you the data fetching here is just this route data. It's funny, it's get server data. It's funny it's just like this kind of route data function, more or less. And what we can do now is we can turn on SSR true. One thing that you might have just saw there and you might be going, what's going on is in SSR false mode, our API routes can still work. So you can make it so that like just the client side isn't SSR'd. It's an interesting choice, but it is something one could do. But now I'm going to change it to SSR true. And when we do that, you're not going to see that loading right now because we're actually doing an async render, not streaming. We could change it to streaming in the info, but it doesn't really matter. For the point of my example here, if I look at the network and clear all the logs, you're going to see where are my docs? Part of me wonders if I've edited the wrong file again. I'm not. Yeah, let's make sure that I actually built it. Because what we should see is now the HTML is the whole HTML. And what we should also see, what we're not seeing, is that the data fetching does not happen on the client, which is very strange. Sorry, not Discord. Fine. Good question. Okay. Something's up with the server, create server data. Give me 2 seconds. Being too fancy here. This is what I get for playing with this exact same demo on stream before I come here. Okay, yeah, I don't know. Okay, that's a good question why that was happening with create server data, but essentially what we now see here is that when we refresh this page now, we're not getting any fetch requests happening because it is until we navigate. When we navigate, we're going to see the fetch request for the new data, but essentially on load, we now have rendered our page into our document here. There we go. And we see it all here. Okay. So this is pretty typical. This is like how a Next.js type app works. We get server-side props. So this is like kind of like one stage up, right? But one of the cool things we can do with experiments like this is we can actually look at different types of modes of how we can do rendering. And one of those kind of examples is this one here, is what if we do here something, I don't know if you've heard of Astro, but essentially if we could not send all the JavaScript for this page, because this page that we just loaded, it loaded sorry, where is it? sorry, this is why you open this stuff in incognito and not in the thing, because this inject script is from my my Chrome add-ons. Incognito page, of course. Now let's load it. We'll see that for this particular page, we're looking at something surprisingly large, but whatever. We're looking at something about 19 kilobytes here, right? And the thing is, what if we didn't have to do that? What if we could only ship less JavaScript? And I'm going to build this again. Of course, this is what happens. Oh, you know what it is? Sorry, I forgot part of my demo. This is me being sloppy. We also have to define, change one piece of our code here, where I'm going to say that now, actually, before we do this, sorry, I'm actually just going to open up another one really quick here. Doesn't really matter. What I didn't show you guys was the comments page. In the comments page, you actually need JavaScript no matter what you do, because you want to be able to collapse these comments, right? And essentially, this page needs JavaScript to interact. The comments kind of toggle all the way down through the page. Like they wrap recursively through the page. It's kind of hard to avoid putting JavaScript on the page to make this work. And what we can do here is we can say that toggle, we can make it into an island now. So this kind of inverts the flow a bit. And yeah, because what the compiler error was telling me was that the compiler was actually looking in the comment and actually seeing both versions of toggle. So let's start here. Const comment. Did I not save it? Just delete this whole thing right out so it doesn't. I didn't import it. My bad, sorry. Solid start. Port unstable island from solid start server, I believe. No, solid start. And there we go. Build. And if we do this now, there we go. What we end up doing is sending significantly less JavaScript. In this case, this was 19 kilobytes before. It's now 7 kilobytes. And essentially, our comments still work, even though it's smaller, but at a cost, because when we switch pages, we're now actually doing a full page reload, because this is how we save sending the JavaScript. We don't need the JavaScript to render the parts of the page that don't change. So again, all we did was change that one little import, and now we can kind of define that, no, these things actually need to be on the client. And we significantly save the JavaScript payload. But what's cool about this is we can continue to do this sort of experimentation. And one of the examples of that is we actually like, okay, what if we wanted to embrace this and actually add a router to this mechanism? And that would allow us to keep our client-side navigation. Well, again, just one piece building on top of one piece. And the fact that the way that Beat slices the plugins makes this a lot easier for us to kind of experiment with, that I'm not going to change any of the other code. I'm just going to say island router true. And essentially, we got like a little bit more JavaScript here. I think it's now like 0.2 kilobytes. It's still doing this, significantly smaller than what it would be otherwise. But now when we navigate, this thing isn't actually refreshing. This is a client-side navigation, and it does this by passing HTML, actually, of all things, over the wire on the API request. That way, the server still renders the static parts, and we can send the least amount of JavaScript. We can get the benefits of the fast page load and small JavaScripts of partial hydrated frameworks like Astro, but we can keep the client-side interaction. And the way it actually does this is it uses nested routing still, because we wrote it as nested routing. And if I expand this out, you'll see that this header never needs to change. I mean, obviously doesn't in that example, but let's find a story. Yeah, with 700 comments, you'll see that it just swapped this out down here. It didn't even touch this because it's the same nested routing technique that you might find in Remix, except it's applied to islands. So we can save the JavaScript and get the experience we've come to expect from a developer experience, and keep that kind of like single page app feel and statefulness, you know. So this is really compelling. We actually got the community to help us. Adi Osmani was working on a movies demo, Taste Movies demo app with a bunch of frameworks, and we were like, okay, well, let's see if we could take that technology and apply it to an app that's a little bit more interesting than a Hacker News demo. And so we did, right? This app, you can, I did add a cheesy browser like reload, but if you see this isn't spinning on us. This is actually client-side navigation here. And what we'll see is, even though this page kind of behaves, you know, how you'd expect, we've still managed to send very little JavaScript over the wire here. This page is 13 kilobytes of JavaScript, and it doesn't matter if I'm navigating around because it didn't need, like, honestly, this is mostly static page. If this was an MPA, you probably wouldn't send almost any JavaScript. Maybe a little bit for these posters, but essentially it's just anchor and error boundary in the router. It's very minimal, but what's cool is it just doesn't, it's scale. You know, this is the end. We don't need more JavaScript unless, okay, let's add a search feature. Okay, you know, and what's cool about this is we can type in the search and have it do stuff, and our input not lose focus even though we're refreshing the page. So like this kind of means to have the interactivity we expect from a single page app is real, but we can, with the savings you can have from a multi-page app. I'm very excited about this technology. That's why I wanted to show it off, because, you know, 13 or 14 kilobytes of JavaScript is actually insane for this demo. Like they made this demo in other meta frameworks, and like Solid Start regular would be about the same as FeltKit. We're basically very similar. So it'd be like something like 34, 35 kilobytes of JavaScript. We're less than half with this demo, right? And, you know, you start getting to stuff like Next and Angular. What I did to get these numbers is, this is not a single page load. This is like doing what I just did. Load a page, navigate to the next listing page, and then clicking into one. So I am counting some of that, you know, page navigation stuff going on, because like the initial payload for Svelte is only 26 kilobytes, you know, which is only double, so it's not a big deal. But I was pointing out here with these numbers is like how it scales differently. We're changing the math essentially, and that's interesting to me. So that's mostly what I wanted to show here. I just want to show how Solid Start is both our foray into meta frameworks from being able to use what we're familiar with and build on top of these primitives. But I also want to show that like it's kind of pushing forward how we look at experimentation and furthering the Solid ecosystem and innovation, how we continue to stay at the front of innovation, how we continue to, you know, push the boundaries. I was too lazy to make another slide, mostly because I just can't top this one. This is like my favorite slide. This is from an AWS conference from a couple of years ago. I just keep on coming back to it. I said, I would have told you be crazy to take this on before. Like, Solid Start is a lot of work. But honestly, now that I see what we can do with this and see what we've kind of started to accomplish here, I just can't picture not, going through this work to be able to like show off this potential. It is in beta, so you can go and try it right now. The beta is largely less about features and mostly about bugs, like you saw tonight. There's a big list. Could definitely use some help triaging that stuff. That's something the Solid ecosystem definitely needs to find our balance on, because we have a lot of trailblazers and maybe not. There's a split, but when people go off and build, crazy stuff, there also has to be, people working with it every day and actually, making sure things are stable. But yeah, it's there. You can try it. The docs are also rough. Could use help, but it's out there, and that's the important part for where we're at right now. I just dropped some social links and stuff, but yeah, that's what I wanted to say today. And if you really like nerding out on this stuff, I've got my YouTube channel. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Ryan actually streams every Friday around, 3-4 o'clock EST. So you can check that out. They're usually about 3 hours, sometimes 5 hours.
They're more 5 hours these days.
More 5 hours. I'm going to welcome Moshe up, and he's going to be giving a talk on SolidJS X transforms. Yeah, how do we do? There you go.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. My name is Moshe. If you're on, right, my talk today is about. My talk today here is about the JSX transform for components. That is, Ryan showed before the whole reactivity intro, a little bit about how the transform turns JSX into DOM elements. I'm going to concentrate specifically about how it transforms component calls in JSX. By the way, is the mic is good, or is it? I think it's a function rating. It's not good.
Yeah, it's kind of spotty. It's tricky to work with.
Yeah.
Feel free to not use. I think everyone can hear you.
All right.
Or use it. It's up to you.
I think raising my voice will be better.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Ryan actually covered this in his talk, but he did it in like half a slide. So we're going to spend like 15 slides on it instead. So let's begin. First of all, about me. My name is Moshe Umener. I am on the ecosystem team at SolidJS. At work, I'm a software developer at Mix.com, the Dropbox for music. If anyone's interested in music, check it out. On Discord, you'll find me at Fool's Wisdom. Yes, I have a lot of Fool's Wisdom to impart. And at GitHub, find me there. So this begins with Ryan showed before, all components are just functions. That means we don't rerun an entire function and then diff the output or replace the output with the output or whatever. We just run it once and then we update fine-grained whatever updated. So it's very important, right? Because since JSX transforms DOM JSX into real DOM nodes, if we were to rerun our whole function every time we updated count over here, we'd be recreating the button. In this case, it's, well, just the button. If it's another component, this might be half your application, which you're re-rendering, which is okay if it's VDOM, right? It's not that okay if you're doing it all the time, but because it's DOM nodes are expensive to create, you don't want to be constantly redoing that, right? So it's very important that we limit our re-renderings, which is why, as a performance consideration, it's very important. Functions only run once. So what happens when you only run your component once? How do you update your state? How do you update the DOM, right? So in this case, I just took an example from Create Resource. My point here is that if you're passing a signal somewhere, you need to pass the signal, right? You need to pass by reference the signal, not the value. If you pass the value, you just get the value. You have no way of listening for updates, subscribing to updates. Create Resource actually accepts either one of these. But if you pass the first case, then you're only passing the value. You can never update that. You might update item ID, but it's not going to rerun because you only passed value. If you pass the signal itself, then every time you update the signal, then you rerun the fetcher. This is pretty core, right? If you're looking at solid primitives library, then you'll notice that a lot of the primitives there, they accept either oftentimes functions specifically in order that they should be listen to updates on signals. Yeah. So similar to how primitives work, you would think that, oh, well, components work the same way, right? If that's how primitives work, then when I pass, if I have this counter that I showed before, I split it here into two components, right? So it's the child, the parent, and the parent is just creating the state and passing it to the child and passing the update function to the child. So you think, oh, it's literally the same thing. All I'm doing is I'm just accessing it on the props object, right? It's literally the same thing. I have to pass the signal and call the signal. Same experience I would have if it was all one component. This is pass by reference, right? Pass by reference is the intuitive way that you would handle this. So you can write components this way. I think I imagine in Voby, which is our Fabio on the ecosystem team wrote a trimmed down version of Solid. I believe that's how you would write something like that. That's how you would write it. You can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But we're going to concentrate on here. This talk is about the feature of the transform that lets you actually pass by value, or pretend you're passing by value, and still have everything work. And we'll see why that's an advantage. So what's the downside? Why would you not want to author components like you do in Voby? So the problem here is that if I want to pass, this is just an abstraction over a span element, right? There's nothing special here. But what happens if I want to write the text inside should be dynamic? In this case, I want to modify it. First, I want to make sure my text is uppercase, right? So I need to know, am I being passed text, or am I being passed a function that returns text? Am I passed a signal, or am I passed the string itself, right? And which one should it be? Should it just be text to uppercase, or should we wrap it, right? How do you manage that? So obviously there are ways around this. Most obvious, of course, is that if you're passing a string, never pass a string. Always pass a function that returns a string. That's not great. You could. It just means you're wrapping things all the time. You could do that, right? Or second option is that you can use this resolve function all the time. It just says, oh, it's a function, it's a signal, let's resolve it. And then everywhere you're busy using this resolve all over the place, saying, oh shit, you're constantly checking, am I being passed a primitive value, or a function? It's not great. I would say this is probably a worse option than overwrapping things and functions. But again, if you want to do this, it works, right? But again, we want to avoid this. So Ryan showed here earlier about how we have transitive dependencies, right? If we have your signal, we create the signal, we have a function that literally is nothing, just returns the value of the signal, and we have the effect, which calls that function, right? Calls get count. It's not the code doesn't explicitly call count, right? Svelte compilation wouldn't really work here. But this is all runtime dependency tracking. So the effect is tracking the count, right? It's tracking the count signal. So since count is transitively accessed inside the effect, so it is now a dependency of the effect, and the effect will rerun whenever it changes. Right? Even though it's transitive, it's not directly accessed, and this is all a feature of Solid using runtime tracking. And this is the trick that Solid's going to use to allow us to pass signals by value, or make it look like we're passing by value instead of passing by reference. So how does it work? So here's an example of passing things by value, by value. Yeah. So we're not calling the function. We're not calling props.count. We're just accessing it. Here we are passing it by value, right? We're passing the value of count. This is what we want. This is our end goal. This is what we want it to look like. We don't, and we want to pass a value, not by reference, right? And the reason is that this way we can choose. We want to be able to choose. Does this count? This can be a static value, or it can be coming from a signal, and it should be tracked if it's coming from a signal, if it's static value, whatever, just pass the static value. So what can we do to get that functionality? Yeah, so we had that parent function before. Let's just go back so we can all see it again. Yeah, the parent function is literally just parent, create signal, and creating the child. What if instead of the naive way you would compile that code would be to this, right? You would say, oh, child is a props object, count, passing by value, so we pass in count and set count. The problem with this is obvious that there's no way of tracking updates to count. Whatever the value of count was at the beginning, that's what you're left with, right? There's no way of tracking that. But the solution is actually pretty simple. We just wrap, instead of count being a property, it's a getter function. And under the hood, right, if you access props.count, you're actually accessing this getter. And this getter is just calling this function. So because transitive dependencies are a thing, well, whenever I access props.count, it's actually a function call, even though it looks like a static property access. Right? And of course, Solid's compiler, we'll see in a moment, Solid's compiler will even if Solid compiler did this all the time, it would work the same way, right? It doesn't matter. Because the important thing for us is that we shouldn't have to wrap it ourselves. We shouldn't have to wrap it in functions ourselves. And we shouldn't have to be using a resolve function. This way, Solid's compiler is doing it for us. You don't have to pay attention to that wrapping. Solid's compiler doesn't actually always do that, as I'll talk about, I'm sure, at the end. But this is our solution as to how we can use props.count, and we get tracking reactive. We pass a value and still get reactive updates. So yeah. This transitive function, right, as I showed earlier, it's the same thing. Function get count, return count, all the same thing, and it works, right? So this way, props.count is always up to date. How are we doing on time? Yeah. So, and as a matter of fact, I just showed what we would compile it to. Solid basically compiles it pretty much the same thing. It's the original code. The only difference here is this create component call I added in. This is what the compiler does. There are reasons why we use create component and we don't directly call parent child directly. Stuff we don't want to get into here, but suffice it to say that Solid's whole run once thing will fall apart pretty quickly. Due to the way that things are actually inside other effects and effects we run, and we just create a mess. So therefore, we always use create component. But conceptually, it's just calling child with that object there. Yeah. Okay. So that's the body of my talk. Like, we're not doing effects. We're not syncing props from the parent to the child. We do obviously use effects to update the DOM, but there's only one effect at the bottom. Everything else is just a bunch of transitive dependencies that rerun that last effect, right? There would be a lot of overhead if we were trying to sync properties instead. Yeah, so which props are in togethers? In this example, the compiler, right, only compiled count, didn't compile set count. The reason is simple. Set count is never going to update. It's just a plain variable. Variables are not reactive, right? You have to either call a function, a signal, or a property access. So the compiler knows that set count is never going to update, but count might update. So it goes ahead and wraps that. And of course, if it happens to be a static variable in there, like it's just a function one-off that turns a string, who cares? The effects, well, at the bottom, we'll just call it never rerun. So yeah. So this explains our very, very common issue that we have in Solid, which is don't destructure your props. And the reason, I hope, after this explanation of how component props work, it's pretty simple, right? Because the way we do it is that we use transitive dependencies. So that means we're tracking whatever is called during the effect execution. If you destructure your props, you're calling that setter right when the function begins instead of inside an effect, right? And that means that your effect just gets a static value, the value of the signal. What we want is that we should have props.count should look like a value, just for it's nice to alter components that way, but it should actually be a function call. It should be a getter call. If you're destructuring your props, then you're accessing the value at the point of destructuring, which, again, if you destructure inside an effect, then you're actually tracking those properties inside the effect, which is fine if that's what you want, right? But if you're destructuring in the definition of the component, then you're going to have a problem because you're just getting a bunch of static values, and the compiler's efforts to help you just can't help you because the compiler only touches the JSX. There are, of course, some Babel plugins that have been built to abstract this away that say, oh, you can destructure your props, and the Babel plugin will bring it back into one props object, and then just access it in the appropriate places. This is a thing. Babel Understructures plugin or something. There are I think is one. There's another one. Solid Labels I think supports this. There are a few Babel plugins that have been built in the community that allow you to destructure if that's what you want. Finally, also, it's not covered here. I should have added it, but whatever. There's also the ref property. The ref property is a special property. It's handled specially. Even though the ref property is if everyone's familiar with the definitions, the ref property on JSX can either be a function or it can be just a static variable, and Solid will assign that variable. When you pass ref to a component, though, or really in general, it always gets passed as a function. So internally inside the component, if you ever try doing props.ref equals whatever, that's not going to work. It's props.ref, and then you call it with the element that you want. So I would show an example of it, but whatever, didn't make it in. Just something you should probably take a look with the compiler if you're interested. I think that's it, right? Yeah. Finito. And we're done. Make it in time, yeah?
It was actually perfect.
Right.
Thank you.
All right.
So I think we'll just go right into Q&A. So we'll anyone has questions, we'll
Do you want to do it on stream?
Sorry?
Do you want to do it on stream?
Yeah.
All right.
Actually, there's a question that came in from the stream.
Yeah,
Let's start off with that. So Sir Meow Meow says, sorry. The question is, under what circumstances would Solid be more advantaged than Vanilla Astro, specifically for e-commerce?
The islands stuff. Sorry, Vanilla Solid, or is that the question? Because
Under what circumstances would Solid be more advantaged than Vanilla Astro, specifically
Okay.
for e-commerce?
yeah, okay, yeah. So here's the thing. Like, if you're gonna build islands, which you might want to do with e-commerce, that's what we did at eBay. I worked at eBay. Some of you might know Marco is one of the original partial hydration, basically as islands frameworks. You probably, for e-commerce performance, page load matters, SEO matters, search results, like getting that whole thing. You're probably gonna want to do islands. I think that given that islands in Solid Start are an experimental feature, like in theory, the islands option gives you something comparable to Astro, except it's only works with Solid. Advantage use Astro is you can bring in any framework you want. So there's that. But I think it becomes a more interesting question when we get out of the experimental and into the islands router kind of zone, because then it's kind of interesting. There might be places where you want to keep that state around or do that kind of client-side stuff. I think the potential of that in the future is very interesting. But generally speaking, I would say that, like, given that these are both experimental features in Solid, I would just use Astro with Solid right now, and kind of do that. I also think one of the big benefits of Astro is actually it depends on, like, I think the authoring experience is really, really quite nice, especially scaling up from like the very like basic cases up to a zone where we probably meet somewhere in the middle on some of the e-commerce stuff. So I think that's kind of how I do my decision matrix. If I was doing it today, I would decide how much I cared about client-side navigation. I want to be clear here. Like, eBay uses React in its checkout, just in case anyone cared about it. It seemed good. You got flows, you got forms, you got all that stuff. But eBay would not use React for its like buyer pages, like with actual item listing pages. Different use cases, different scenarios. So like, yeah, if you're fine with using, like, if you're going in for optimization, because like the MPA version is ultimately going to be more optimized than even the client-side router thing. I'm showing that you can lose small percentages to get that client routing, thing with that kind of hybrid model. But you know, like, I don't know. I don't think it's there yet. Is what I say. It's so we'll see how if that changes in the future. But right now, as I said, I do Solid with Astro. I think that's a really powerful combination. Made some great sites. Just like recently, NordVPN went that way. It's pretty awesome.
Sammy?
I'm curious how the island stuff works. I mean, I'm sure it's a very complicated answer, but are you just swapping the HTML completely? Because you showed us that the island router call just gives you HTML. And so you just like yanking HTML out and replacing it? How does that work with like signals, that the same signals being used in both routes maybe?
Right. Yeah, well, the nested routing, there's two elements of it. The nested routing, which is quite nice, gives us the ability that we're swapping it onion style. So like if you do a navigation on like a smaller section of the page, you don't unload the top level, so you keep all that. But yes, there was an example. I kind of glossed over it a bit, but the search example is actually a good example of this. And with search, we're actually updating that panel. We send HTML. Got to thank the Astro guys for this too. Nate from Astro wrote something called Micromorph, and essentially we are actually doing a DOM diff there. And essentially, when we hit an existing island, we just keep and preserve the state in those client islands. So even though I didn't want to label it the same exactly, the solution is basically equivalent of something like React Server Components. If you want to understand what React Server Components are, they use JSX to do it, but it's a very similar kind of concept where we are actually able to diff the stuff outside of the islands. Essentially, it's a great library. Nate offered to make it even smaller for us. Right now, I think it's something like 1.3 kilobytes to get that DOM diff. He's like, oh yeah, I do a bunch of head stuff. We could probably like shave like even more size off of it. So, but yeah, that's essentially the trick. We do a DOM diff for those cases, and it's usually not that expensive consideration because it is like when you're navigating. One of the guys from the Chrome team, after we posted the demo, I think the Hacker News one, he was like, I kind of feel bad telling frameworks, and like telling people that they should get under 200 milliseconds on their P75 on IMP. That's interaction to next paint. It's a new metric that Google's using to kind of measure like how fast future interactions, like past page load are. And he's like, but after seeing that demo, I don't feel as bad anymore. So I took that as high praise for this potential of this approach. He said he did a bunch of basic tests with the Hacker News example, and he was able to keep within his range for IMP. So yeah, we still have more work to do, but I think that's pretty exciting.
Small follow-up on that. Are you like, what are you sending to the server when you're asking for the next island? Do you sometimes have to send a lot of state? Like if you have this whole tree and you only want an island, you're only changing a small deeply netted thing, and it depends on a ton of signals and stuff.
Yeah,
send that to the server.
No. Right now, and this is a place that problem gets more pronounced the more optimized you make the solution. But you're right, there is a challenge there. This is why context is a challenge with this paradigm. If you've seen it, right now we're completely re-rendering on the server, like from the head down.
Okay.
And then sending the pieces that we need. React's gone the next step of optimization where they're only re-rendering the portion, which is why it's much more obvious with the context breakage and whatnot. So I think this is the biggest challenge on that, because I this is why I'm talking about where things aren't ready yet, because I see that level of optimization of completely being able to parallelize the nested routes and also the potential of not re-rendering client components on the server and filling in the holes. Right now, we also, if the same client component exists on the server, or like in the client, we just render it on both sides and then go, oh, we'll keep the client one, just update the props. But that rendering on the server is also unnecessary. I think those two optimizations will improve the performance, but also introduce new constraints. And that's why I don't feel like the models were completely there yet. Same reason why React Server Components is a little bit rough right now too. I think this is a zone that requires more exploration. I think what's really exciting about this approach is with those two optimizations, you can eliminate the overhead of server components almost completely in really client-heavy scenarios. Server components can basically transform into JSON APIs. If you're not sending a bunch of the HTML and only serializing the props, you're essentially making a JSON API. I think this shows the potential for server components to actually scale, or this kind of pattern scale all the way from like mostly static sites all the way to like full single page apps. But I think we have some stuff to figure out still.
Question. Great step, for making seamless runtime with island support. Do you feel it's realistic to expect in the future to potentially get rid of runtime on the server as well? And it obviously for cases where it makes sense. And pre-render pieces of
Okay, right. Yeah, so the question is, do you think it's possible to get rid of runtime on the server and pre-render? Yeah. It's an interesting question, because I think the challenge is, I don't know if we get rid of the server completely, because because we're talking about sections now. We're talking about like nested sections. We're talking about partials. I think everyone's looking at this. Vercel, Netlify, we're looking at how to use the edge and cache more stuff, because going to the database is expensive. Like for every what do you call it? Is it D1 or R2 or like Cloudflare? Like for every attempt at putting databases on the edge, there's going to be companies that can never do that ever. I worked, before I went to work at eBay, I worked in education, for example, and I all day long dealing with GDPR and dealing with data security, privacy, because we stored photos of children. So like there's certain things that will not go there, which means that caching static is the only way you're going to get a certain amount of performance benefit. So I can see more stuff running to run ahead time, compile time, more SSG. But I think it's interesting is that it feels like that range is becoming more of a, in the same way we've been blurring the lines between client and server, with showing the islands and like the server functions. This is very much blurring the lines between static and dynamic is what my expectation is. So while I don't know if we end up with fully static in this thing, because I feel like we might need a service to stitch it together, is the best way to put it. I expect most of the work in this area actually to be about caching and static generation, which is like part of the reason why Next did that thing where they patch global fetch or whatever. It's very important for these models to be able to look at how we can still deliver on static. We're sort of betting on edge functions right now. I think that's kind of where things are at. I mean, I've definitely been kind of following along with these trends. Might not be a coincidence that I work in Netlify right now. So like, I think that there probably will be solutions there, but my feeling is this, that generally speaking, caching is always like the last stage optimization. There's a couple things that fall into that zone. And for that reason, right now we're at a point where we're doing a lot of architectural pattern optimization. The caching is like the last thing. You don't necessarily want to like choose your caching strategy first, because then like you might limit like the optimizations you make for architecturally, because caches always miss or always fail or whatever. And I think that's probably why SSG is taking like a little bit of a back foot, but we will get back there. I'm almost positive. It's like just the last piece once you figure everything else out.
That's partially why I'm asking if you can generate rather than cache, because generation doesn't get misses.
Well, it depends. I mean, I don't know. To me, it's the gray scale, like, because like generate is just like when you create the cache, because like stuff can still get out of date, and I realize like you can be like okay with that getting out of date, and you can preemptively do it, like ISR and DSG, on the different platforms. But like, yeah, it's interesting. I know like you can bet that Vercel and Netlify are going to be working on these kind of solutions. So I personally, just where I'm with Solid, I'm very much on the mechanism end of it, but we'll get there.
Yep. Yeah, I got a coworker of mine.
Nice.
He's remote right now. He just wants to ask a question. All right, so yeah, Lawrence. Actually, yeah, Lawrence, go ahead. Nice. He's remote right now.
Hey. Hey, Ryan.
Hey.
This feels so real, guys. Thank you for thank you for taking some time to share with us or you
It's a little delay from the
I think the work that we're doing in the partial hydration is amazing. On top of that, I'd like to know how are the components themselves like actual events handler, like conflict and submit. How does the device handle this? For example, it's like is a solid implementation or how does it work?
So you're wondering what the event handler? Sorry, is this? Do you say under the partial hydration scenario? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, all we're you're wondering what the event handler? Sorry, is this? Delay. Yeah. Yeah. So essentially, the scenario for this is the way our partial hydration works is actually very simple. There's been, if you guys have heard of Quick, there's been some very interesting work towards like breaking stuff up at different levels.
Sorry, Brian.
Yeah.
People on chat are asking if you can repeat what the question is that you had.
Yeah. Yes. The question was about how we handle event handlers under this partial hydration scenario, like the islands scenario, and the whole trick to this partial hydration thing is actually picture multiple solid apps, essentially. So everything actually works fairly naturally within its zone. So anything where you actually want an event handler and interact with it, that has to be in an island, which is why like obviously stuff like navigation, like there's a few exceptions. Like our router can handle it. We put a global. We do have a global delegate, and for like the anchor tags and the navigation, in theory, you don't need it because we listen to all those events. And forms, we could do that in the future. But generally speaking, when you're writing your custom logic, you're going to write in a component, and that component's going to run an event handler. And the first thing it's going to do with that event handler is probably set some state, which immediately at that point, which needs to set state, you're in an island. Like, because that's essentially criteria. If you have state, it has to be within an island. So from that point of view, essentially each of those islands work like their own kind of solid app. The key part is, and it's important here, is that it's all still part of the same solid reactivity. It shares the same single solid instance, the same context stack we showed before. And in fact, when nesting them, you can nest them. You can't import client components directly, or sort of server stuff only directly in a client thing, but you can kind of pass them through children. There's a little trick. I didn't really highlight that on my Hacker News example, but you can take a client component like that toggle and pass server children to it, and those server children could have client components in them. Like, you can nest it. As they execute on the client, we do reconstruct the client, the reactive hierarchy and the ownership graph. So they all get linked together ultimately, the same way they work in another app. But essentially, once you're there, they actually work pretty similar to like how they would work anyways, because once you're in that zone, you have to be in some client code anyways. So right now, that's basically it. Like once you opt into an island, you are in client zone. But as I said, and you see this pattern a lot in React when we use a trick called hoisting state. You can use that trick to hoist state in islands. I think this is underappreciated. A lot of people go, "Oh, you hit an island, now the rest of your app is under an island, so you're done." The reality is, we saw this with eBay. Like we could get 80% client code reduction using islands. Like it can, on pages, because you can do the hoist state trick and essentially pass static children with islands in it. So you can actually get fairly granular just using islands alone. And as I said, in actual real live cases at eBay, we saw between 65 and 85% code reduction using this technique over just using client components. So, yeah.
So when do you want to use islands?
What?
When wouldn't you want to use islands?
It's the biggest limitation right now is state preservation between pages and reload. But the router can solve that. But today the router means interesting stuff like figuring out what the hell's going on with context and stuff. Like we haven't solved all the problems. But in terms of an approach that potentially could give us that future, I think, there's a question here, and we're gonna kind of think about this a bit. Like, do we actually want this single app? Do we want, we've been on this path for a very long time with single page apps where we're like, there should be one app, right? That was why we moved away from Rails and all that kind of stuff, is we kind of had this really awkward thing in the past where you'd have like Rails and ERB, and then you'd be layering your Vue.js code on top and like essentially having for loops in both languages sitting on top of each other, and they weren't hydrating all that. We got to a point where we're like, okay, write everything as a single app. Then we got to a point where we can make it isomorphic and hydrate it. I think understanding what that relationship works like is interesting, and I think that's where a lot of exploration is now, because there's lots of different techniques from it. I like things that I find personally interesting, and I know I've kind of tangent a little bit here, but like it's why I've been following a lot of the island frameworks like Fresh and Astro and Marco and all that, and we see that work in Solid. But also even things like Quick, like interesting kind of thought experiment is they lazy load everything at a very, very, very fine grained level, to the point that you could start with an MPA and end up with a single page app experience. Like you could literally piecewise it up as you interact with it. But that's not even the experience they necessarily want. I'm pretty sure that with containers, they're going to be looking at routing solutions like I showed off here with the Islands router, simply because it's unclear that we actually, there's still an open question whether we want to load all that JavaScript in the browser ever. Does it ever make sense? And until we can answer that question, figuring out the best patterns for authoring are kind of a challenge. I think the answers aren't clear right now. I'm interested to see in the next year or two if we get to a point where people are like, oh, that just makes sense. I think we're gonna have several of those moments. Like when I saw Astro for the first time, I was like, whoa, that makes sense. But there's also the question of is that where things stop? How does this evolve? Astro itself included. So right now, answering that question, I'm just gonna say, looking at the solutions we have right now, not counting this experimental stuff, which is, I said, only probably in React, next 13, the server component stuff, and really experimental solid start. Ignoring that stuff, you still have a very clear single page app versus multi-page app trade-offs. Decide what you're going to do. I think when we figure out that experimental stuff, that new beta stuff, I think, and I'll throw Quick in that category as well. I think this question becomes very different. It might take us another year or so to figure that out, or at least see the first inklings. But that's why it feels a lot right now like early single page app days, around 2010s. There's a lot of really interesting innovation going on, and I expect this to be more of that before we actually kind of settle down to be that is the way. This is one of those once a decade architectural shifts. I think what we're seeing right now is as big as when we moved to single page apps in the first place.
Okay.
Got a question from chat.
Yeah.
Jay Larkey says.
How you doing, Parasocial?
Ryan, what are the downsides of using islands compared to more traditional Next or Svelte kit architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I did. It's almost the same question. I think it's really mostly just the preservation of client state today. I think in the future that might change, but right now it's like you do have to make a choice, like to go with a multi-page app. Yeah, so I'll just take that as the same as the last one.
Other questions?
I got one actually. So like, yeah, we quite a bit of the focus on my job is around like performance and SEO, and so like I really like what you're doing with like out of order streaming. I'm curious, what your thoughts are around like out of order streaming with SEO, which obviously there's caveats there, and then I guess what the blockers are behind enabling in order streaming for Solid.
Okay, yeah. So out of order streaming, yeah, as you mentioned, the challenge is you need JavaScript to do it,
Right.
which means that not all bots will do it. Like, and even bots that will do it might like lower rank you. Like Chrome can handle it, but Chrome also goes like if it gets to a certain point, it'll sometimes go, yeah, we can tell this requires JS. We'll put you on the next round, and it'll like do down. I think Next was actually looking at this when they did the React 18 release. They at the same time, I actually didn't. I wasn't sure what the right solution was. I know eBay had their own infrastructure for that, but Next actually, when they released, like Vercel released Next middleware, and Netlify has it too. I have to obviously say that as well. Is that we can basically I very much look for the bot agent, and the thing is, streaming to async rendering is like on the same spectrum. The only difference is like when you flush. So like you can, what the lovely thing about streaming is if you write your code to be stream like friendly, like work with streaming, having it not stream just works seamlessly. It's just like when you flush at the end. So from that perspective, you can basically just like have a bot detect that it's one of those user agents that they use for the crawlers and literally send back it as async form. And you'll like, I think that's the solution that they suggested. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And eBay had its own custom infrastructure for that, essentially, where they turn off streaming. eBay also uses a lot of in-order streaming, like a significant amount. Again, e-commerce sites, if you notice them, a lot of them do load very much top down.
Yeah.
Out of order makes a ton of sense for apps, things like Facebook, where you're like, you see the shell and then like the pieces move in. And if you're talking to like 15 different services or even less than that, out of order streaming is a godsend because then you're not waiting for the whole page to load. But yeah, in order streaming, hopefully that answers the first question.
Yeah.
In order streaming is a little bit tricky. I mean, I've seen some frameworks kind of pull it in on the JSX side, but they're kind of faking it. They're kind of just like, oh, I'm just yielding a stream like one at a time. That's not what like the point of in order streaming is more of like you want it baked in the same way that the out of order, and that it just works really nicely. Like I didn't show it in our example, but switching on, like other than the header consideration and the metadata stuff, switching on in order and out of order streaming with React or Solid is just natural. You just turn it on and suspense and everything just magically handles everything for you. It just works. You don't have to do anything special. You don't have to be like, here's the stream, feed it through one at a time. Like that's not how you do it. That's how you do even in order and Marco. The challenge with in order streaming for JSX framework specifically is that they tend to compile. JSX is like function calls. So you like nest onion. It's easy to get to a certain point in the function and go, ignore this. And then just like, we'll come back to it and then continue on because it needs to close. Like it needs to kind of onion in and onion back out. Out of order is hard because you're kind of saying like, get this far and stop, but actually continue going. And you don't have the top part until it returns in JSX. Like that's the best way I can put it, because like it actually needs to fully execute to get it back to the parent. It's just because it returns things. Whereas traditional templating languages do not have this problem. And it's way easier to actually do in order. That's why Astro started with in order. That's why Marco started with in order, because like it's actually much, much easier when they can basically compile their templates to being a bunch of like right, like kind of just like as a bunch of series versus being these nested things that feed into each other. React had come up with a solution for it using suspense list. And I think that was kind of their intention for it. But I don't know if that solves your SEO problem, because suspense list, for example, is like kind of like sticking in order inside out of order instead of the other way around.
So you still need JavaScript in order to.
I think so with suspense list. So this is something that I've been thinking about, because the benefit, the tricky thing is that within order you don't need JavaScript, because literally it'll come in. I do think it's possible. I just haven't because you could always separate the rendering from how you output it, but it requires a different SSR API, and you're not going to find this from most JSX frameworks. Like Solid has a custom compiler, so there's potential for us to like rethink of how we compile our stuff to make it work for in order, but it would take that level of a change. You're not going to find like a Preact or a React isn't going to do that, because like they basically keep the same JSX transform on both sides. So like it's very hard with the nature of JSX versus some of the templating stuff. So yeah, in order is not out of the mechanics of like doing suspense lists for like convenience, but outside of that, like for the actual SEO considerations, is a little bit outside of what I probably thinking about too much right now, because it requires a switch. That being said, maybe server components give us a new way to get into in order, because then and this comes to the philosophy kind of thing. There is a question of if you start, and we haven't made a decision here yet as a community, as an ecosystem, but if you start viewing, how should I put this? If you view single page apps today as isomorphic components, they run on both sides. And then we went through this phase where we like said, oh, let's annotate the server stuff, get server side props and all that, server functions. And if we look at server components and we're kind of inverting the flow now, we're actually perhaps saying that a lot of the code is server only, and that we have little isomorphic bubbles in it. And what that changes means is, depending on how we want the authoring experience to be, and I'm getting kind of a little bit out in the weeds, so I apologize on that side, but we have to decide if we want to write everything like it's isomorphic and just have it happen to run on the server, which is kind of the common knowledge today, or if we recognize that a lot of stuff is only going to run on the server, maybe we can author in a way that actually optimizes for the server. And if we do that, I very much see in order being like in the books, because just simply the way that you can approach that. Because I think, I don't know, it's an interesting thing. If you automate the boundaries, the way that Marco or Quick does, and your developer experience is very client-sidey, it might be hard to ever split that out, because anything could become client essentially, because the way you author it, you don't actually know. Yeah. But Marco's kind of interesting. I mentioned it because they actually have a server first mentality and have the isomorphism, and that's why they're able to pull this stuff out. It'd be interesting to see if we actually start leaning more towards stuff like Astro, where we have a server first mentality on this stuff, and maybe that leads us to a place where this makes more sense. Sorry, that's a really long-winded answer, but I think about this stuff a lot.
I can tell. Yeah. Thanks.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to ask, like, what's your long-term vision with Solid and stuff? Like, are you satisfied with it just being more experimental and just like kind of push the limits of what frameworks, and then maybe some other frameworks borrow on it, and whatever, or do you want it to be something more similar to what React is today, where it has like a whole ecosystem? If I want to build React app, I'm going to use React.
Yeah, and it's because the Solid project in general has multiple facets. Solid Start is at that experimental stage. That's why you keep on hearing me talk about islands, and a lot of people are very curious about Solid Start. That's why I talked about today. I knew this would be a topic. That is still very much in that zone. Even after we iron out the bugs in beta and get it to 1.0, my gut feeling is we're building right now at the pinnacle of like one paradigm, and the next one's coming at the same time. So there's going to be a bit of like stuff going on, different patterns. We're seeing that happen right now, and that's kind of where Start is. I want to solidify it so that like today's paradigms are the best in it, but Solid Start's going to keep on evolving. But Solid itself is a framework made of primitives. We do want to continue to work on those primitives and make them better and streamline them, but it changes things a little bit because I feel very differently about Solid compared to Solid Start in that sense, because Solid itself being built on these primitives, things that we tested over the years, things that are slower to change, things that are, I can see that piece, going into that zone like React is, like whether like the biggest thing for us now is that the way Solid does stuff is actually quite different. I don't think people appreciate that enough today. Like they go, oh, I've seen MobX and React. No, like it's not that. It actually changes the way you'd approach, I don't know, a WebGL renderer, or like it's not just the stuff we've seen with the DOM or native. Like it actually is a different pattern than React is, and that's why the stuff that Solid's we worked a long time with, stuff that we're familiar with in the web. Sure, that reactivity and stuff is pretty stable, and I can see it expanding out. It's just that when we get into newer areas, stuff like meta frameworks, stuff like even some of the things I just mentioned, like native, we're going to have to find out new things about it, and we're going to get there first through experimentation. So I think the core Solid web experience, things like single page apps, this is why I want Solid Start to kind of separate the beta from like this experimental stuff. I think everything that we consider along the realm of like what React does today, or Vue or Svelte, Solid is a great choice. It's stable, it's good, and we're just going to keep on doing better there. We're going to just streamline things, performance, size, just keep it going. I think for the more extended stuff, I think it's a more interesting question. I think there's still a lot to learn, and hopefully with all of you, and people at home, we will learn, even more.
Can I throw a question?
Yeah.
This is asked a lot outside the community, and there are lots of answers flying around, but it would be great to have like an actual answer from you on this topic. A lot of people ask about the differences between Svelte and Solid's approach to compiler, and you always give lots of different opinions on this. It would be great to have like a consistent response to it.
Yeah, consistent response between Svelte and Solid. I mean, the reason that it's a hard topic is because both frameworks have slightly different goals. The compiler itself is a reflection of those goals. Where when I do that demo, when I convert reactivity into JSX, and you see that, you're like, that shows Solid's value there. It's this kind of transparency. I want you to walk away from this and go, I could have built that. Like that's the difference with the compilation. That there's some kind of mechanism that's easy, that could be understood, reactivity, and there's some kind of compilation, and you never lose that control. And that's kind of, I don't know if that philosophy is something, some people think might be a philosophy, at least experimentation, or maybe it's the advanced user thing. This is just what I came to respect. I've used Knockout this way for many years at a startup, and like I Knockout app in production for like 8 years. I don't know too many people who had Knockout apps in production for 8 years. Looking at like the other Knockout dev in the room, yeah. So for me, like that's just like part of the values, and Svelte kind of like they care about the easiness, the developer experience, in terms of like how they can like make it approachable to anyone and everyone. So like Svelte's compiler does a whole lot more. It literally compiles everything. Like you write something you write something that looks like JavaScript, and you get something completely else different back. And I think that is sort of like the difference there on philosophy. Like mechanically, I've talked about this a bit before. That's like some people, I think I do get this on Twitter. Sometimes people like saying that Solid like ripped off Svelte and uses JSX instead. And I sometimes have been very rude to people who have said that. Admittedly, I usually try and like, especially if it's repeat. Like usually I try and explain the difference. But like there's a big difference between what I showed with like just some runtime reactivity and a compiler that augments that for you, and like basically a compiler that is the whole world, that compiles everything. Svelte does have runtime reactivity in stores, but its core mechanism is they do literally compile away the components. Like they basically compile it to something. I'm not going to say the same, similar to React, but almost closer to React than to like Solid, where there's like dependency arrays basically fixed into the code, and then when you update state, it reruns a portion of the component. They are smart enough to split the component into life cycles, but essentially, like there's fixed dependencies, a life cycle, and that's what reruns. And it's kind of hard to explain that because it means that both on philosophy and mechanically, we're actually talking about two very different projects. I hope that somewhat covers that. I know it's a little bit vague and a little bit detailed. Sometimes the combination doesn't really work. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the focus on the approaches makes a lot of sense. We hear that a lot. On the technical side, just I guess the compiler approach and the sizes are radically different. That's one of the major differences.
Sorry, what is
The
radical?
compiler sizes, like Solid's compiler is probably
Yeah.
a lot smaller.
It's less complicated. Svelte does a lot of really cool stuff. They test accessibility. Like they built accessibility into the compiler. That's really cool. So yeah, I mean, different priorities with the project from that perspective, and it's funny because sometimes me and Richard kind of like just completely miss each other, which I think is hilarious. Because like in the sense that like someone will say something about Solid and he's like, yeah, he'll sometimes say, they're similar. If you like JSX, use this. If you like templates, use that. That's such a simple response. I kind of love it because like for most people, that's actually what the difference is gonna be, because it's actually really reflective of the philosophies, even though it's not accurate, so to speak, right?
It's a reflection of Rich's personality.
Yeah. So, yeah.
There's another question from Jay Larkey on here, and I'm assuming this is triggered by the Tanner Lindsay tweet today.
I didn't see that.
I think he said it's beginning to feel a lot like Solid.
Like Christmas, yeah. I mean, he's been having a lot of fun. Tanner's been rediscovering reactivity. We've been talking for like a year and a half, but he's finally got a chance to kind of play around with some Solid's reactivity and he's enjoying it a lot. I expect great things for Solid's ecosystem to continue into the future. Yeah, I just think more and more people are seeing the power of that reactive model and understanding what it means for them, especially people like Tanner who spend all their time in tables and complicated UIs where like re-rendering everything is very wasteful. So like it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, he's been doing a lot of very positive Solid tweets. That's because he's been writing stuff with our reactivity. So I expect some bigger announcements into the new year. So,
well, you answered the question. What should Solid team do to support TanStack router port to Solid?
Yeah, I mean, and we're already working on that right now. The TanStack router port. It's challenging, obviously, because, I mean, but Tanner has stepped up to kind of look at this. I mentioned before that Solid needs specific tools. Taking a router that was written for React and having it work for Solid ideally doesn't really work because it's like, oh, let's just re-render stuff or immutable change. We need a different criteria. But Tanner is investing in looking at this reactivity. So I think it'll be exciting to see where that goes. I think it's interesting too because his stuff's very feature rich, and our stuff's always been very much on the size side of things. So trying to figure out how to balance that and seeing if we can find even more optimal ways to do things in the future, I'm looking forward to.
Sammy?
We just had a question actually about the last topic, the interest part about the getter, kind of like how Solid compiles the signal calls to getters.
Yeah.
It got me wondering, it seems like you're compiling it down to getters everywhere. Have you considered, might be a silly question, the obvious answer, like, why won't the create signal function from the beginning just return getters instead, or does that just break the fundamental way that the signals work?
Oh, yeah, I mean, they are a getter in a sense. They're a function getter. Like they're like, if you mean like why we don't do an object, like a single object, I mean, because then it's just heavier on the syntax, right? Like you could do it. The biggest thing with the getter is that the props is kind of throwaway. Like, and I find it the same with a store. You can go like s dot what you actually care about. I guess with a signal you could go s dot what you care about, but it was just like the shortest way to write something is just call a function, and it's transitive to like we keep on using this term transitive, but it's like if you have a value from props or a store or something, like a function call is the most primitive way of doing it. Like you can always go function wrap count function times 2 or props.count times 2. It becomes a function. Stuff just keeps on becoming a function. So it seemed like the more primitive way to do it. I think a lot of times when you see APIs with like dot value, they have a read and a write. They have a getter and a setter, and that has completely different implications on your application if you're like passing that around. To be fair, if we're always accessing the value, you aren't actually passing the setter around. But my suspicion is if you put the getter and setter together in the same object, people would be more tempted when they wanted the setter to just pass the reference through instead of the value through. Whereas if you separate them, people are more likely to be like, okay, I'm doing something specific. I'm going to pass the setter through. And quite often the pattern is you wrap that setter with a more specific action, like in a counter, an increment. You're actually passing increment through. You're not passing the generic setter through. So I find these patterns of read-write segregation and just they encourage better patterns. I know that didn't completely answer, but I think both the combination of the terseness of just a function and the way that everything is a function, and the fact that we want that read-write segregation kind of inform that API.
Yeah, as someone relatively new to the solid space, I've really appreciated what I've seen of the new documentation. Can you give a little bit of updates on what
Right.
we have more robust version of it?
Yeah, for sure. The Docs Next project, we call it, or docs.solidjs.com, was an initiative started by Dan Jutan, who works also on Astro. Truth of the matter was he did a lot of effort to get that going, talk to Docs people, rally that, bring people in to kind of work on it. Which happens sometimes when people go very successful if they do an open source and then they manage to get hired on open source. Sometimes they don't have as much time to work on other projects and find ways to contribute in the way that more aligns. In Dan's case, what ended up happening was he's actually not working at Docs on Astro. He's working on product, and he was working on educational content type stuff, and so he started doing more of that with Solid because it aligned more with what he was doing, and he was working less on Docs. Instead, he was making videos, conference talks, and stuff like that. And admittedly, we haven't really had a Docs lead for some time now, so that project did kind of slow down. Luckily, in the last 2 or 3 months, we've had people in the community step up on the Docs project, especially shout out to Michael. It is plodding around slower, albeit, but everything's basically done by volunteers. It is a kind of slow progress, but at least it's moving again, which is key. But yeah, it's an ambitious project. I wrote the original Solid Docs in like 6 weeks, and the kind of obvious I wrote them for mostly worse probably than better, but the new project is much better, much more inviting. We have an outline, like a roadmap that Michael's been following, that Dan actually laid out. I think that's going to be the key, right? When we can get to a certain point where we can swap over, that's probably, and you're probably wondering when that is. I am not sure. Do you have an idea?
Yeah, it's going to be a while. The reality of the situation is the Docs projects, we've tried a couple initiatives, kind of, give it an injection of life. We actually have a Solid Fellow. So we started a program called Solid Fellowship, where we're using the bulk of our open collective money to bring people on board, give them a stipend per month, and have them focus on different parts of the ecosystem. So we filled both those roles with 2 ecosystem members, and the third one is actually for Docs. And so we had an application process open until I think it was October 31st. So we've been sitting on about 15 applications for people who want to work on docs and get that stipend per month. We have interviewed two people so far. We have to interview the third. We're about to make a decision on it. And that person will lead the effort, not as a core team member, but as someone to help basically shepherd the project as much as they can right now. That'll be a 5-month, $1,000 US per month stipend. We're hoping that person will transform into our docs lead and come on as a core member. But at this point, we're still open to other people who have an interest and also experience in leadership on the docs level in core. It's a really tricky problem to solve. There aren't many people who can write well and also understand Solid.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's an intersection of like type of person that like Dan was the only person. And that's why we brought him on board. We're like, you come in here, like you're hired. So you know his focus onto more DevRel stuff now has been amazing because the content he produces is amazing. You can check out the SolidJS YouTube channel. It's a lot of really good work there. He's responsible for all of it, almost all of it. But you know, when a team member, especially in open source, finds something that they're passionate about, they're just going to go ahead and do it. It's not like a job where you can be like, no, you're doing docs. So we're suffering from this, and we're getting a lot of flack for docs. I'm going to be brutally honest. We're a very open, transparent community, and we get a lot of flack for docs. I think it's been called tech bro a couple of times now.
Yeah. Which
is a very painful word because I don't think anyone in our community has that kind of essence. Like, can we define tech bro? But the language in it does really come off as completely inaccessible. And so we're doing our best to like soften it, make it more accessible as much as we can, but also trying to pour all that effort into the DocNext effort. That's a really long way of saying we're struggling. We need people to come into the community and support on this. Yeah. So that's also a rally call. Please, if you have a passion for writing and if you want to learn more Solid, we'll support the learning process if you can bring the writing methodology.
Yeah, docs are such a big part of this. Like the amount of work and effort that goes into docs, especially like not even getting to stuff like translations and languages and stuff. Like Solid's current docs are translating to something like 17 languages, something
like 15.
Yeah. So like way more work than goes into frameworks or even Solid Start. And Solid Start has docs too that need attention. So it's like there's just like that's where the work is. Like it's actually the docs and the education, not the actual framework writing. So it's like, yeah, that's a place where we need to figure out how to encourage the growth the most. As I said, stuff like fellowship program's great, but like it is difficult by its very nature, because like in the past when we've had the right docs, people have had to like stop almost all of what they're doing and just try and focus on docs for a bit. But that's also doesn't always get you the best docs when you're in that kind of zone.
We're in a very interesting, weird spot as a community. We're not corporate backed. I mean, Ryan's supported by Netlify, and they're amazing that way. But we're not. Yeah, we don't have a team of paid individuals. I give my time as complete volunteer. The rest of the core pitches in as much as they can. We really depend completely on the community. This is a fully open source effort, and that's a really hard thing to do. So we're leaning on the backs of a lot of people, and you know, we're not React. We don't have a whole boatload of money and a team to make it happen. But this is our challenge. If we can get over this, we got the engineering covered. We got a genius behind us. Actually, we got a couple geniuses behind us, and that's what I'm confident in. What we really need to turn around and make magic out of is how do we rally the support to get the rest of it over the finish line.
Yeah, I think docs are, like I mentioned before, being a big deal, but I think a lot of the perceptions about Solids and the like required an advanced audience and all that stuff is because of the docs and because of the lack of certain types of documentation. I think it'll make a huge difference. There's no reason, and I've seen this when people have come on the doc side. There's no reason for Solid to be treated that way. Like perspective, like reactivity is a simple, like it's not easy necessarily, but it is a teachable concept that once you get it, the rest can fall into place. So I feel like if we approach it the right way, we can definitely be much more approachable than we are today.
Yeah, I think Solid has both a curse and a blessing. We're a very technical community. There's a lot of knowledge. You drop it in the Discord, and there's people talking about incredible topics. Like, they know their stuff. There's a handful of people that you have any sort of problem, they'll solve it in a heartbeat. The curse that we have is also they're all experts. The people who know how to teach beginners aren't there. And so I think we have the opposite issue from a regular framework, like Svelte, let's say. Very easy to teach, very accessible. They've got a lot of people willing to go in and make that happen. And there's a good foundation for that. But it starts because a lot of those beginners come in, they feel like they belong there. They feel like everything is accessible. That's the focus of the framework. With us, it's kind of like, well, we're not easy. We're not an easy framework. We're a simple framework. There's a difference, massive difference between easy and simple. So you'll have different levels. Like the chart for complexity over time is different. You start, easy with Svelte, but I've heard I'm just repeating things that I've heard, but you get progressively more complex as you build a larger application. With Solid, you kind of start with a higher level of complexity, but it's pretty consistent, or it gets even easier because it's the same building blocks and principles that you work with. So just these two different mental models of how to use the framework make what we do on the onset of the project a lot harder. So we're, that's our challenge. If we can beat that challenge, we'll do very well as a community, and we'll have an amazing solution for people. I'm done ranting.
All right.
Any other questions?
First.
I guess I have a question about the RPC system in Solid Start. So I may completely misunderstand this, but as I understand it, you have some JavaScript have some people and isometric functions together. So when it's rendering in that environment, you want to call it a third-party API, so your own API. Does that help anyone from the edge environment?
Okay, yeah. So the question is about both the question about the RPC stuff with Solid and about the isomorphic stuff and the edge functions and how that all plays together. Yeah, there's a few different levels there, right? Because obviously, if you just don't use any of the server functions and you just do it isomorphically, the call will happen on initial server render, yes, from that edge function. So it'll call your API from, I don't know, Southeast Asia, if that's where you're accessing it from, and it'll call that from that edge function. And then in the future from the client, you'll go directly from your browser wherever you are, Singapore, and then call it. When you do the server function or the create server data or create server action, then what you're doing is pushing all those requests back to that edge function, to the third-party API. So yes, the client will always request to your edge function, then your edge function will then go out to that API from the edge. So yeah, there's latency there if your database is in Virginia East or whatever, AWS 1 or so that is a real cost. That's why I was talking about caching earlier. That's why streaming comes up a little bit too. Streaming actually softens that a little bit because then you don't have to wait for the full response. But if it's the core of your data, then streaming, it's better than client side rendering because you don't have you get to start the request sooner, but it might feel kind of slower because you get the shell of the app and then you're still waiting some time for the app for the data to load from halfway across the world. So data fetching and edge functions is still a concern, and why people are looking at so many cache solutions, or why Cloudflare is looking at how they can put databases on the edge. But yeah, the server function, it just moves it from the end user's computer to that edge function, essentially. Does that answer the question? Or
Yeah, and the Solid Start is possible to do both ways, but
yeah.
Once it's already rendered,
Yeah, exactly. There's the server versions with a $sign, and then there's like the route versions without the $sign that will be where like we'll do it from the client after the fact. So we have both versions. And create resource, the default primitive will work from the edge on initial and then from the browser after the fact. So you have to use the server function if you want to push it all in. There's some advantages there for things like authentication. You can kind of push everything through a single funnel and just like know that you can like get your OAuth tokens, and all that kind of stuff, handshakes and all that happening from the back end. But I mean, there's challenges there with edge functions too, because they don't like live forever. So like there are still considerations here, and that's why we need better best practices and guides and stuff there, because definitely patterns like authentication, I know you didn't ask that, but definitely come into play when kind of straddling that line, because you're gonna like, oh, who owns the access token or whatnot. So it does somewhat simplify things. This is why Remix is kind of popular, is that of pushing everything to the server, because then you can just be like, that's the place, and then you use some session cookies and stuff, and then don't worry about kind of doing this dance where you pass stuff to the client. But if you've done single page app development stuff, you've probably done this dance before as well, so we can do either, I guess. It's a simple question, but there's repercussions of those decisions.
There's also some really cool technology that's been coming out. Like Cloudflare has Argo, if you've ever heard of that. And it's actually like a routing technology for the server that basically finds the most efficient path to the network that you're calling. And then they charge like $5 a month for this. And it's supposed to decrease your latency by like 50 milliseconds or something crazy like that. So it's like cool technology to help with those long distance kind of latent calls. Anyways, that's another fun thing that's happening on that side, but can take advantage of that. Really cool.
Yeah, one of the cool things Cloudflare that we haven't done with some of the other adapters yet, is that our dev environment uses MiniFlare, and then our deployment uses Cloudflare, so you can actually like use versions of like KB and stuff like in development. This is what Nikhil is using when he's playing around with like durable objects and like getting WebSockets working on the edge and stuff with that. So definitely cool stuff. Of course, it's not documented anywhere, so I apologize. I mean, it will come, but common thread here. But we've talked about docs.
Yeah. So we have like 4 questions on chat, but let's power through them, and then we can all head home, because I know it's a bit over our time.
Okay.
So Nikhil just said I apologize too. For the docs, I assume. He's in chat right now.
Awesome.
Okay, so like some of these can be yes/no questions. Let's keep it to like a couple sentences.
Yeah.
So the first question is, if you were to create Solid today, where would you start, or would it be no different?
Yeah, I mean, pretty similar. I think the reactivity is the core, the primitives are the core. So if I was going to do it again, obviously we've learned stuff where we've kind of tagged stuff on. I do it differently, but generally speaking, I start from the same core of stuff, and in a sense, Solid 2.0 is going to be that. So,
cool. So Derek Ferris, I'll just respond to your question, which was, do you need Solid core docs most? Yes. The answer is yes. We need that as a top priority, and then Solid Start should come after that. Jay Larkey, what is the ideal size of Solid as a framework? Number 3 like Svelte, or number 1 like React? I think he means in like downloads or use.
I mean, I don't know if anyone. Do you think Svelte intentionally sets out to be like number like where it is? I don't know.
Is it even number 3?
No, but I mean, I just mean like I'm not sure. I think I don't see any reason why this approach couldn't be mainstream. Just as I'm sure Rich doesn't see any reason why Svelte couldn't be mainstream. This isn't an experts framework. Is kind of my take.
Yeah. Well, yes. Experts, I have to put a bit of spin on that. An experts focused framework, but still accessible to beginners. The goal, I would say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in this, we want to help beginners move into that realm of being experts.
Yeah, I mean, that's the bar we want to lower. Yeah, definitely. I don't know if it depends on how you classify experts, but the desire of maintaining control is important more than anything else. So I mean, I guess that's something that might appeal more to people with more expertise, but I don't think it needs to. Is the word.
Derek Ferris is suggesting powerful but accessible. That's probably a better way of putting it.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. What features in SolidStart would say are new? It seems like most concepts are tried and true, but with a new look. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The problem is, for us to implement them, we couldn't just like grab them straight. Like, there's a reason why we didn't do loaders like Remix. But yes, most of the stuff with SolidStart was more about just having SolidStart exist for like the SSR stuff, like the streaming and all that stuff. Like, you gotta remember, we added streaming to Solid in 2020, I guess, just over 2 years ago, and like a lot of these things aren't new. The nested routing we've had since around earlier in 2020 as well. Like, I'm trying very hard not to introduce new stuff in SolidStart. The reason it's only the experimental stuff that's new because it doesn't exist anywhere else. Most of the other stuff, it's just been a matter of trying to like offer some missing primitives that are like we don't really have in the wider ecosystems, particularly associated with SSR. But in general, I agree that the thing is to do it the solid way is unique. That's the challenge. Like when we do a remix style invalidation thing, we can actually invalidate on keys. We can, and more so when your resource refreshes, it doesn't re-render the whole page because it's not a React thing. We actually do fine-grained reconcile of the store with a data diff internally in that router action. So when you do something silly like, I don't know, update a to-do list, I'm just using silly examples, and you just toggle it, we're still able to go, oh, only that toggle on that one to-do updated, and not re-render the whole page, not even re-reconcile the list, literally go into that one to-do and flip the toggle in it. So like that's not the same, but it's also like not new. So it's an interesting balance. Looks can be deceiving, but yes, for us to get to where we did with this stuff took some thought. We couldn't just like pick up what others had done, even though it looks similar. That's
it.
Awesome. Yeah.
Ben had his hand up. Did you have a question
earlier? I did.
If it's fast, just throw it out there.
Yes, it is. But I was playing with like all the server stuff on the stream, and I got two competing opinions on how I should fetch stuff.
Yeah.
So one was like the route data export, use the hook. The other one was try the server function, use the $. And I realized, okay, well, one of them lets you do parallel fetching, a bunch of nested layouts, and one doesn't. So I'm wondering, like, server is really cool, but when would I use it?
Right. Yeah. See, and this is the thing. You talking about the server versus having these primitives and stuff. This is one of the debates I had on documentation. But like, I actually kind of wanted to only introduce create server data and create server action, and just like put the rest in an advanced section. That's what I actually wanted to do, and show people like the proper ways. The problem is when you write docs just kind of flat, and it's the same problem with the main solid repo. We just give people a data overload. I did it today even when I was demoing it, where I showed all the stuff because I wanted to emphasize from a low level how we build up on stuff. But the truth of the matter is, the place you use server is basically if you don't want to use our stuff and you want to use like solid query, 10stacks version, and you want to port that in, or you have some other primitive you want to do, you want to use it for server sent events or WebSockets or something. Like if you want to like build your own stuff, that's why you use it. The truth of the matter is we should really enforce with guides like create server data, create server actions, and then people could come in and like basically be like, oh yeah, it's like Remix, and just like that kind of like streamlined, everything just works. You don't need to know any of this. It feels way less complicated if you just go route data, create my route data, and just move on with your day. And that's the intention of why we introduce those higher level APIs. But the lower ones still exist because, that's what we do. So
yeah, the stuff in the lower ones is so simple.
Yeah. Right, but the thing is, you do that, and then you go, oh, but then I need to do reinvalidation and like all that kind of stuff. So we just don't teach stuff nearly as well as we could, and that's the theme here, I think, tonight.
Yeah, we need to do a lot better job at this.
Thank you.
Yeah, that being said, we're gonna wrap up. I want to thank Eric, our gracious host, and Babbel.com. This was amazing. We really appreciate the use of space.
You're not like in the camera.
Sorry. We really appreciate the use of space and the graciousness of the snacks and the drinks that you provided. We'd like to give you this T-shirt from SolidJS.
Oh, sweet. Thank you.
So
Appreciate
here you
it.
go. Thank you very much.
Do the same thing in reverse.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
All right.
So, I don't know, I guess we're kind of shunning this thing. It sucks. So, anyways, yeah, for the same thing. First off, I'd like to thank all y'all for showing up. It was a pleasure to have you all here with us, and hope you got as much out of it as I did. Thank you to the Solid Core members. Got a little bit of swag here for you guys.
Nice.
I forget which sizes we got here,
We'll
right?
sort that out.
I got the we can figure this out later. But got swag for Moshe, Dave, and Ryan.
Yeah. Cool.
So thank you all for putting so much work into these presentations. Really loved answering our questions, everything like that. And yeah, again, thank you all for coming. And yeah, it's been great.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to end this.
Yeah,
end the
please,
stream now.
Please end the stream.
Thank you all for joining online. Thanks.
Just a last note. There were a couple individuals that wanted to come, and they kind of wanted me to give a bit of extra information.